Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. In the lecture today, I want to talk about the presidency of Ronald Reagan and what is sometimes called the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. Specifically in this lecture, we'll look at the rise of conservatism and how Ronald Reagan came to develop a viable conservative vision for America. We'll also examine the appeal of Reagan and talk about his first term in office. We'll address Reagan's effort to combat communism through an accelerated arms race. We'll evaluate Reagan's second term and talk about how the IranContra scandal threatened to tarnish his record. And finally, we'll look at the legacy of Ronald Reagan. By 1980, the power and prestige of the United States seemed to be on the decline. The turbulent and often tragic events of the 1970s, such as the communist conquest of South Vietnam, the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation, the energy shortage and stagflation, the Iranian hostage episode, all these things generated what was termed a crisis of confidence. And there was real backlash of resentment taking place in America. Ronald Reagan, with almost perfect timing, emerged to tap the growing reservoir of public frustration and transform his political career into a crusade to, in his words, make America stand tall again. The United States, Reagan declared, remained the greatest country in the world. And he said, "We have the talent, we have the drive, and we have the imagination. Now all we need is the leadership." Reagan's ability to make the American people believe again in the greatness of their country won him 2 presidential elections, in 1980 and then again in 1984. Just how revolutionary the Reagan era was remains a subject of intense debate among historians. Yet it can't be denied that Ronald Reagan's actions and beliefs set the tone for the decade's political and economic life. So let's look at the background of Reagan and how his conservative vision of America developed. Ronald Reagan was born in Illinois in 1911, and he graduated high school in 1932 during the despair of the Great Depression. His first job was that of a radio sportscaster before moving on into an acting career in Hollywood in 1937. Reagan appeared in 31 films before serving 3 years in the Army during World War II, where he made training films. During this time, Reagan was a Democrat who had voted for Franklin Roosevelt all 4 times. And after the war, Reagan became the president of the Screen Actors Guild. This is the acting professions union. His leadership of SAG helped him hone his negotiating skills, and it also intensified Reagan's anti-communist ideas as he fended off efforts of communists to try to infiltrate the union. In the 1948 election, Reagan campaigned for Harry Truman. But during the 1950s, Reagan came to believe that the federal taxes were too high. So oddly enough, in 1960, he campaigned as a Democrat for Republican candidate Richard Nixon. And then 2 years later, Reagan joined the Republican Party. He achieved stardom in 1964 when he delivered a rousing speech on national television on behalf of Barry Goldwater's presidential candidacy. Republican conservatives found in Ronald Reagan a new idol whose appeal survived even the defeat of Goldwater in 1964. And supporters convinced Reagan to run for governor of California in 1966, and he won by a landslide. As a 2-term governor, Reagan displayed flexible practicality in working with Democrats in the state legislature. By the eve of the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan benefited from 3 developments that made his conservative vision of America much more viable. First, the 1980 census revealed that the proportion of the population over the age of 65 was growing rapidly, and they were moving from the Midwest and the Northeast to the so-called Sun Belt states of the South and the West. These population shifts forced a massive redistricting of the House of Representatives, with Florida, California, and Texas all gaining seats, and northern states such as New York losing them. The Sun Belt states were attractive not only because of the mild climate, but also because they had the lowest tax rates in the nation and the highest rates of economic growth. And many of those who moved to these areas tended to be a growing number of evangelical Christians and retirees. These attributes also made the Sun Belt states fertile ground for the Republican Party. Second, in the 1970s, the country experienced a massive revival of evangelical religion. A survey in 1977 revealed that more than 50 million Americans described themselves as born-again Christians, and religious conservatives formed the strongest grassroots movement of the late 20th century. During the 1970s and 1980s, they launched a cultural crusade against the forces of secularism and liberalism. For instance, Reverend Jerry Falwell's grassroots organization, the Moral Majority, which was formed in 1979, expressed the major political and social goals of the religious right wing. They summed up the group's beliefs as the following. First off, the economy should operate without interference by the government, and the government should be reduced in size. They also believed that the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade, passed in 1973, legalizing abortion, should be reversed. They held that Darwinian evolution should be replaced in school textbooks with the biblical story of creation. The Moral Majority also believed that prayer should be allowed back in school. And they thought that Soviet communism should be opposed as a form of pagan totalitarianism. Falwell, who was a televangelist minister of a huge Baptist church in Lynchburg, Virginia, stressed that the Moral Majority was not a religious fellowship. Instead, it was a purely political organization which was open to conservatives of all faiths. Falwell's Moral Majority recruited over 4 million members in 18 different states. Its base of support remained, however, in the South, and it was the strongest among Baptists, but its appeal extended across much of the country. But Falwell's cultural crusade also outraged many Americans, as Democratic leader George McGovern called Falwell, quote, a menace to the American political process. One curiosity of the 1980 presidential campaign is that the religious right opposed Jimmy Carter, who was a self-professed born-again Baptist Sunday school teacher. Instead, they supported Ronald Reagan, who rarely attended church, he had been divorced, and then he'd remarried. These factors in itself were almost, at one time, had been an automatic disqualification for the presidency. But curiously enough, during the 1980 election, the fact that Reagan didn't go to church very often and he'd been divorced and remarried, these things raised very little notice among the voters or the Moral Majority as well. Nor did the fact that, as California's governor, Reagan had signed one of the most permissive abortion laws in the country. That Ronald Reagan became almost a messiah-like figure of the religious right can partly be explained in the force of social issues of the time, and also to Reagan's political skills. A third factor contributing to the conservative resurgence was a well-organized and well-financed backlash against the feminist movement. During the 1970s, women who opposed the social goals of feminism formed counter-organizations with names such as Women Who Want to Be Women and Females Opposed to Equality. Spearheading these efforts was Phyllis Schlafly, a right-wing Republican activist from Illinois. Schlafly orchestrated the campaign to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment, and then she served as the driving force behind a growing anti-feminist movement. She urged women to embrace their, quote, God-given roles as wives and mothers. Feminists, she charged, were anti-family, anti-children, and pro-abortion. So by 1980, the national conservative insurgency had coalesced into a powerful political force with substantial financial resources, carefully articulated ideas, and a grassroots energy of all these things that helped to fuel Ronald Reagan's presidential victory. So now let's look at the election of 1980 and talk about Reagan's first term as president. Reagan's promises of less government, lower taxes, renewed prosperity, a revived military strength, and renewed national pride appealed to many voters in 1980. On Election Day, Reagan swept to a decisive victory with 489 electoral votes to 49 for Carter, who only carried 6 states in the election. Reagan's lopsided triumph represented a resounding victory for conservative Republicans. Ronald Reagan was quite different from Jimmy Carter. Where Carter was by training a technocratic engineer, he was also a compulsive micromanager who in the end was unable to inspire either his party or the public. In contrast, Reagan was a pragmatist, a visionary, and a conservative, uninterested in the details or the complexities of an issue, but with a clear blueprint of what he wanted to accomplish. Reagan succeeded where Carter failed for 3 basic reasons. First, Reagan knew what he wanted to accomplish, and he pursued his primary goals, such as lower tax rates, a reduced federal government, increased military spending, and an aggressive anti-Soviet foreign policy, and Reagan pursued all of these goals with steadfast consistency. Second, Reagan was clever at tactical compromises and legislative maneuvering with congressional leaders as well as with foreign heads of state. And third, Reagan had the gift of inspiration. His infectious optimism inspired Americans with a sense of common purpose and a revived faith in the American spirit. Even those people who disagreed with Reagan's policies found themselves drawn to his carefully honed public image. He was a master of television and a gifted public speaker, and that led to his nickname, the Great Communicator. He appeared rugged, fearless, and seemingly resistant to danger or misfortune. Just weeks after taking office, he turned 70 and was the oldest man to serve as a U.S. president. But throughout his presidency, Reagan appeared to be vigorous and youthful. He spent many vacations on a California ranch where he chopped wood and rode horses. Even after he was wounded in an assassination attempt in 1981, he joked with doctors on his way into surgery saying, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." And then after the surgery, Reagan appeared to recover with remarkable speed. Reagan became president during a time when America was suffering from what Jimmy Carter had called a crisis of confidence. To put it simply, the economy was a mess. Reagan, however, seemed to be unfazed as he brought to Washington, D.C. a conservative philosophy that he summed up as, quote, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." He used an economic model that came to be called Reaganomics. The idea was that by reducing taxes and easing government regulation of business, free market capitalism would be able to spur economic growth. This in turn would produce more government revenue and help reduce the budget deficit. Reagan credited 1920 Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon, who served under President Coolidge's administration, as the source for Reaganomics. Using this example, Reagan on August 1, 1981, signed the Economic Recovery Act, which cut personal income taxes by 25%, lowered the maximum tax rate from 70 to 50% for 1982, and offered a broad array of other tax concessions. In the meantime, Reagan made an effort to reduce federal spending on various domestic programs. Liberal Democrats strongly criticized Reagan and accused him of trying to dismantle vital welfare programs. Interestingly, Reagan recorded in his diary at the time that the press was trying to portray him as undoing the New Deal. He recorded that he always reminded the press that he had voted for FDR 4 times. Yet Reagan also revealed in his diary entry that it was not the New Deal he was after. Instead, he was determined to undo the Great Society because, in his opinion, it was LBJ's war on poverty that, as he said, led us to our present mess. Overall federal spending for all social programs in 1982 was $53 billion, and this was higher than the total for 1980. But because this figure was less than what Carter had initially proposed, critics assailed Reagan for reducing the dollars spent on education and cultural programs, public housing, food stamps, and school lunches. Democrat Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill declared that the new president, quote, "has no concern, no regard, no care for the little man in America." Reagan responded that he remained committed to maintaining a safety net of government services for the truly needy. And Reagan was true to his word. The food stamps were cut by only 4% from what the Carter administration had planned to spend. Yet Reagan's advisors realized that the cuts in domestic spending had fallen far short of what the president needed in order to balance the budget in 4 years, as he promised. Also, massive increases in military spending complicated the situation, and Reagan's advisors warned him they were heading for what they called a crash landing on the budget. And they were right. The soaring budget deficit triggered the worst economic recession since the 1930s, and this was probably Reagan's greatest failure. His aides finally convinced Reagan that the government needed what they called revenue enhancements, otherwise known as tax increases. Congress passed a new tax bill in 1982 that would raise almost $100 billion, but the economic slump continued throughout 1982 with the unemployment at about 10.4%. In early 1983, 30 states had double-digit rates of unemployment. Yet by the summer of 1983, a major economic recovery was underway, in part because of government increased government spending and lower interest rates, and in part because of the lower tax rates. But the federal deficits had grown ever larger, so much so that the president who promised to balance the federal budget in 1983 had in fact run up debts larger than those of all his predecessors combined. Nevertheless, Reagan was willing to tolerate growing budget deficits in part because he believed it would force more responsible spending behavior in Congress and because he was committed to increased military spending. Reagan's conduct in foreign policy reflected his belief that the trouble in the world stemmed mainly from Moscow, the capital of what he called the evil empire. Reagan had long believed that former Republican presidents Nixon and Ford, in following the advice of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, had been too soft on the Soviet Union. Reagan described Kissinger's emphasis on détente had been, quote, a one-way street favoring the Soviets. To put a stop to the advance of Soviet communism, Reagan developed a strategy to exert constant economic and public pressure on the Soviets. In short, Reagan wanted to reduce the risk of nuclear war by convincing the Soviets that they could not win such a conflict. And to do so, he and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger embarked upon a major buildup of nuclear and conventional weapons. Reagan also hoped that forcing the Soviets to spend much more on their own military budgets would bankrupt their economy and thereby implode the communist system. So in stark contrast to his efforts to cut back on government spending on social programs, Reagan gave the Pentagon a blank check saying, "Spend what you need." To critics who complained about the enormous sums of money being spent on U.S. weapons, Reagan replied, quote, "It will break the Soviets first." And in the end, he was right. In 1983, Reagan escalated the nuclear arms race by authorizing the Defense Department to develop a controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. It was also nicknamed Star Wars. Under this SDI plan, they talked about constructing a complex anti-missile defense system in outer space that would intercept and destroy Soviet missiles in flight. SDI was the most expensive defense system ever devised. Despite skepticism from scientists and others that such a Star Wars defense system could be built, the new program forced the Soviets to launch an expensive research and development effort just to keep pace with the United States. Over the course of Reagan's 2 presidential terms, defense spending totaled nearly $2 trillion. Reagan's anti-Soviet strategy involved more than accelerated military spending. He also borrowed rhetoric of Harry Truman, John Foster Dulles, and John F. Kennedy to express American resolve in the face of what he called communist aggression anywhere in the world. Détente deteriorated even further when the Soviets imposed martial law in Poland during the winter of 1981. The crackdown came after Polish workers united under the banner of an independent union called Solidarity challenged the communist monopoly of power. As with the Soviet interventions in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, the United States could not intervene in Poland. But Reagan forcefully protested and imposed economic sanctions against the Polish communist government. He also worked behind the scenes to support the Solidarity movement. Reagan's foremost international concern, however, was in Central America, where he detected the most serious communist threat. The tiny nation of El Salvador, caught up in 1980 in a brutal struggle between communist-supported revolutionaries and right-wing militants, received U.S. economic aid and military assistance. Critics argued that U.S. involvement ensured that the revolutionary forces would gain public support by capitalizing on what they called anti-Yankee sentiment. Supporters countered that allowing a communist victory in El Salvador would lead all Central America to fall to communism. By 1984, the U.S.-backed government in El Salvador had brought some stability to the country. Even more troubling to Reagan was the situation in Nicaragua. The Sandinista socialist government, which had seized power in 1979 over a corrupt dictator, was sending Soviet arms to rebels in El Salvador. In response, the Reagan administration ordered the CIA to begin training and supply anti-communist Nicaraguans called Contras, which was short for counter-revolutionaries. the Contras staged attacks on the Sandinista bases from Honduras. In supporting these so-called freedom fighters, Reagan sought not only to impede the traffic in arms to Salvadorian rebels, but also to replace the Sandinistas with a democratic government. Critics of Reagan's policy accused the Contras of being right-wing fanatics who indiscriminately killed civilians as well as Sandinista soldiers. They also feared that the U.S. might eventually commit its own forces, leading to a Vietnam-like intervention. The Middle East also was a concern for President Reagan, as it remained a powder keg during the 1980s. No peaceable end seemed possible in the prolonged, bloody Iran-Iraq War. In 1984, both sides began to attack tankers in the Persian Gulf, which was a major source of the world's oil. Although the Reagan administration held no great trust in either nation, it viewed the Iranian fundamentalists as the greatest threat, and they began funneling aid to Iraq, a policy that would end up carrying very dire consequences. Nor was any settlement in sight in Afghanistan, where Soviet occupation forces had bogged down as badly as the Americans had in Vietnam. American officials considered Israel as the strongest and most reliable ally in the volatile region. And at the same time, American diplomats continued to try to seek to encourage peace between Israel and moderate Arab groups. The forces of moderation, however, were dealt a blow in the mid-1970s when Lebanon, a long-time enclave of peace despite its ethnic complexity, had collapsed into an anarchy of warring groups. The capital at Beirut became a battleground. The Israelis had responded to attacks across the border made by the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO. In 1982, Israeli forces pushed the PLO from southern Lebanon and then began shelling PLO strongholds in Beirut. French, Italian, and U.S. forces then moved into Lebanon as peacekeepers, but in such small numbers they became targets as well. On October 23, 1983, an Islamic suicide bomber drove a truck filled with explosives into the U.S. Marine headquarters at the Beirut airport. The explosion left 241 Americans dead. The Israeli forces pulled back to southern Lebanon while the Syrians remained in eastern Lebanon, and bloody anarchy remained a way of life in a formerly peaceful country. After the blunder in Lebanon, Reagan was presented with the chance to score a victory closer to home. On the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada, a former British colony and the smallest independent country in the Western Hemisphere, a leftist government had recruited Cuban workers to build a new airfield and then signed military agreements with other communist countries. In 1983, an even more radical military council seized power in Grenada. Appeals from the government of neighboring island nations led Reagan to order 1,900 Marines to invade Grenada, depose the government, and evacuate a small group of American students who were enrolled in medical school there. The UN General Assembly condemned the actions, but it was very popular among the people of Grenada and in the United States. Although a lopsided affair, the decisive action also served notice to other Latin American revolutionaries that Reagan might use military force elsewhere in the region. So now let's talk about the election of 1984 and Reagan's second term in office. By 1984, Reagan had restored strength and vitality to the White House and to the nation. As the economy surged with new energy, reporters began to speak of what they called the Reagan Revolution. The slogan at the Republican convention was, quote, "America is back and standing tall." By contrast, the Democrat nominee was Walter Mondale. Endorsed by unions, the National Organization for Women, and prominent African Americans, Mondale was viewed as the candidate of liberal special interest groups. Indeed, he set a precedent by choosing his running mate, New York Representative Geraldine Ferraro. Mondale's acceptance speech somewhat complicated his campaign when he stated, quote, "Mr. Reagan will raise taxes and so will I. He won't tell you, I just did." Reagan responded to this by vowing never to approve a tax increase, and he scolded Mondale for his commitment to tax increases. Reagan also repeated a theme that he had used in the campaign against Carter, saying that the future, according to Mondale and the Democrats, was, quote, dark and getting darker. Reagan's vision of America's future, however, was bright with optimism and hope. Mondale was buried in the election. In the end, Reagan took 59% of the popular vote and only lost Minnesota and the District of Columbia. In his 1985 State of the Union message, the president clarified what had come to be called the Reagan Doctrine in foreign affairs. The United States, he proclaimed, would support anti-communist forces around the world seeking to, quote, defy Soviet-sponsored aggression. America, Reagan promised, would not hesitate to intervene in the world's hotspots. Yet for all of his stern talk about the Soviet Union being the evil empire, Reagan was determined to reach an arms control agreement with the Soviets. In Geneva in 1985, he met with Mikhail Gorbachev, the new leader of the Soviet Union. The two signed several cultural and scientific agreements and issued a statement on arms limitation talks, but no treaty was in the offering. Nearly a year after the Geneva summit, Gorbachev and Reagan met again in Iceland for 2 days to discuss arms reduction. Early reports predicted a major breakthrough, including a total ban on nuclear weapons, but the talks collapsed after disagreement on Reagan's commitment to the Strategic Defense Initiative. After the Iceland meeting, the two nations reduced the scope of their discussions in order to break the impasse. The breakthrough on arms negotiations came after Gorbachev announced he was willing to deal separately on a medium-range missile treaty. So after 9 months of negotiations, Reagan and Gorbachev met amid much fanfare in Washington, D.C. on December 9, 1987, and signed a treaty to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear missiles. These are missiles that travel from anywhere from 300 to 3,000 miles. This marked the first time that the two nations had agreed to destroy a whole class of weapons systems. Also, it represented a key first step toward the eventual end of the arms race altogether. During the fall of 1986, the Reagan administration suffered a double blow. In the midterm elections, Democrats regained the Senate by 55 to 45. So for his final 2 years in office, Reagan would face opposition in Congress. Even worse for the Reagan administration were reports that the United States, with Israeli assistance, had been secretly selling arms to Iran in the hopes of securing the release of American hostages held in Lebanon by extremist Islamic groups with close ties to Iran. Such actions contradicted Reagan's repeated public insistence that his administration would never negotiate with terrorists. Yet it appeared this was only part of the story. Over the next few months, revelations disclosed a series of covert activities which were carried out by administration officials. At the center of what came to be called the IranContra Affair was the decorated Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. An aide to the National Security Council who specialized in counterterrorism, North had been scheming to use the profits from the secret sale of military weapons to Iran to subsidize the Contra rebels fighting in Nicaragua, even though Congress had voted to ban such aid. Under increasing criticism, Reagan appointed an independent counsel led by former Republican Senator John Tower to investigate the scandal. The Tower Commission issued a report early in 1987 that placed much of the responsibility for the bungled Iran-Contra affair on Reagan's loose management style. The president appeared to be unaware of what his staffers were doing. The investigations of the independent counsel led to 6 indictments in 1988. A Washington jury found Oliver North guilty of 3 relatively minor charges, but innocent of the 9 more serious counts. His conviction was later overturned on appeal. The Iran-Contra affair hurt the image and popularity of Reagan. So let's talk about the Reagan legacy somewhat. Although Ronald Reagan had declared in 1981 his intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment, the welfare state remained intact when Reagan left office. Neither the Social Security system nor Medicare had been dismantled or overhauled, nor had any other major welfare program. Also, federal agencies that Reagan had threatened to abolish, such as the Department of Education, not only remained in place, but also had seen their budgets grow. The federal budget as a percentage of the gross domestic product was higher when Reagan left office than when he entered. Moreover, he did not try to push through Congress the social issues championed by the religious right, such as allowing school prayer or ban on abortions. Yet Ronald Reagan succeeded in redefining the national political agenda, and he accelerated the conservative insurgency that had been developing for nearly 20 years. His greatest successes were in renewing America's soaring sense of possibilities, bringing inflation under control, and stimulating the longest sustained period of peacetime prosperity in history. More importantly, Reagan helped to end the Cold War by negotiating the Nuclear Disarmament Treaty and effectively lighting the fuse of the democratic freedom in Eastern Europe. In June 1987, he visited the Berlin Wall, and in a very dramatic speech, he called upon the Soviet Union to allow greater freedom within the Warsaw Pact countries under its control. He challenged the Soviets, saying, quote, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was great theater and good politics from the great communicator. Through his policies and persistence, Reagan helped end communist control in Eastern Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Although the IranContra scandal hurt his image somewhat, a testament to Reagan's popularity was that George H.W. Bush became the first vice president since Martin Van Buren, who had followed the popular Andrew Jackson, to win election immediately after the president under whom he served completed his term. Reagan's admirers praised him for reasserting the values of self-reliance, criticizing government excesses, and restoring national pride. Aspiring Republican politicians still seek to recapture the Reagan magic.